Good morning. I'm Jessica Matthews, President of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and I have the great pleasure of welcoming those of you to the 2011 Carnegie International Non-Proliferation Conference, those of you who have been with us since the first of these meetings in 1989, and especially those of you who are with us for the first time. Welcome. We are so glad to have you. We're meeting this year in an extraordinary time. The tragic events 3 weeks ago in Japan and the still ongoing struggle to cope with them take us back to the events of 1979 and 1986, reminding us that the most fundamental issues relating to nuclear energy and to those relating to nuclear weapons and the channels of proliferation that connect them cannot be put behind us. Nothing can be taken for granted with this technology, we are reminded. Our thoughts and our wishes go out to the people of Japan, and along with our admiration for the calmness and the determination and the good sense with which they have shown in coping with this disaster. Fukushima puts an extra burden, I think, on those of us here to bring the best of our collective experience, wisdom, and creativity to bear on the issues that we'll be discussing for the next 2 days. The theme we chose for this year's gathering is new actors, new agendas. And let me share with you a few examples, a few thoughts on why we picked this. The global nuclear order, which rests in large part on the NPT, was created during the Cold War, of course, was largely the result of cooperation between the two superpowers in a bipolar system. Or to put it another way, cooperation between the US and the Soviet Union, notwithstanding their competition in so many other domains, made the creation of this order possible. But since the end of the Cold War, the world order has shifted tectonically. States that had seemed peripheral, at least to the major powers, have recalibrated their aspirations and their sense of how they want international relations to function. The developing countries as a whole, and in particular the largest and most dynamic of them, have become major economic players. They are naturally seeking political influence commensurate with their economic power. We see this symbolized, of course, in the shift from the G7, G8 to the G20. India, Brazil, Turkey, South Africa, Mexico, Indonesia, and several others want a greater say in the management of the global economy, the trading system, and international institutions more broadly, and they have increasing attributes of power to back up those aspirations. They are not new actors in the literal sense, of course, but the weight of their influence is new, and it is growing. Similarly, as globalization continues to express itself in many ways, and economic dynamism grows in regions that in the last century were less influential, the importance of industries and corporations involved in producing electricity grows. There has been much talk and now growing debate about the possibilities of renewed expansion of nuclear energy production, the so-called Renaissance, including in countries that do not now operate nuclear power plants or have fuel cycle capabilities. This is one reason why Carnegie has renamed what used to be a nuclear non-proliferation program and broadened our issue coverage and expertise so that it is now the Nuclear Policy Program. With the addition of Mark Hibbs and other colleagues and projects, we are addressing nuclear energy broadly, not just as a proliferation issue. As part of this work, and as reflected in the panels and speakers at this meeting, we are increasingly involving experts from private industry. These, of course, are also not new actors in the literal sense, but their presence in deliberations not only on energy, but on proliferation and international security is relatively new to gatherings like this. Carnegie has been leading a quiet initiative for the past 3 years to provide a forum for traditional and new exporters of nuclear power plants to develop voluntary principles of conduct to guide their activities. The aim is to identify and aggregate best practices and norms in the areas of safety, security, environmental protection, non-proliferation, and compensation for victims of accidents. Governments, of course, are ultimately responsible for setting the laws and regulations for both exporting and importing states, but companies can and should do more to build public confidence that when and where nuclear energy is deployed, it will be done in the most responsible ways possible. We are also reaching out to new actors in another way. As a result of a project we've been conducting in Pakistan with support from the State Department, we have been engaging with talented young Pakistani scholars and think tank analysts there on the issues that we'll be addressing here. We're very glad to have several of these outstanding young experts with us for this conference and for a follow-on meeting with American counterparts that we will be hosting at Carnegie on Wednesday. As to new agendas, the emergence of new actors and newly influential ones naturally leads to new issues that must be dealt with and to some dramatic shifts in the priority given to issues that have been on the agenda for some time. You all do not need me to elaborate on this, so let me just highlight a few of the issues that we will be addressing here more than in past meetings. Most broadly, there is a need to focus more on the shifting lines of tension in the nuclear order, shifting primarily from an east-west to a north-south axis. We will, of course, continue to focus on the critical issues of the Prague Agenda, tackling the traditional, all too familiar difficulties between the US and Russia, and the challenges of achieving a comprehensive test ban and a cutoff of fissile material production for military purposes. But today's challenge for strengthening the non-proliferation regime and adapting norms and rules to manage nuclear energy and fuel cycle development is increasingly about reconciling interests and perceptions that diverge on north-south lines. We will explore these issues starting with our very first plenary as soon as I remove myself from this podium and continue with several other panels at this meeting. Another new item on the agenda is whether and how deterrence and international security can be achieved if and when the US and Russia reduce their nuclear arsenals to low numbers, to the hundreds rather than today's thousands. Low numbers would be a point on the pathway to the complete elimination of nuclear arsenals. So if that larger, longer-term objective is to be seriously pursued, the separate questions about low numbers need to be more fully addressed, and we will begin to do so here. Third, the global agenda also needs to recognize and seek to understand and manage the interactions between two triangular sets of actors in which China is a pivot. The US, Russia, and China are in one of these strategic triangles, with each actor's capabilities and doctrines affecting the others. China is also part of a triangle with India and Pakistan. What happens in the first triangle, therefore, directly affects the second, and vice versa. These interactions will largely determine the prospects for a CTB, for fissile material cutoff, for reductions to low numbers, and ultimately for the health of the world order. We have an important panel that is devoted to analyzing these dynamics. And fourth, for this future of the nuclear suppliers group, which needs to be on the agenda as a more open question than it has been for many, many years. The US-India nuclear deal is the most obvious source of flux in the NSG, but there are others. Pakistan's desire for similar treatment, and the possibility that China might seek to export to Pakistan without NSG approval, tensions over whether or not to continue guidelines against exporting fuel cycle capabilities and under what conditions, and questions about membership in the NSG and whether to change the procedures by which it operates. All of these are critically important and relatively new challenges, and we're happy to have an outstanding panel for you on this topic. All of this is just a small taste of what we have in store for the next 2 days. And I will simply close here by thanking all of you for coming. We have great confidence that we will have an engaging, a vigorous, and a serious 2 days of deliberation. And I look forward to it and to interacting with all of you. Thank you for coming, and we will turn now to the first plenary.
Welcome. We thought it would be great to start with a conversation and to have that conversation pick up on some of the themes that Jessica just introduced to you, and could think actually of no one better to get us started than Ambassador Celso Amorim, who's been Brazil's longest-standing Minister of External Relations, having served first from 1993 to 1994, and then under President Lula from 2003 to 2010. And in that great experience has been an innovator and reflecting the theme that Jessica set out at the beginning of the emerging and growing influence of new major powers on the international stage. And that was the basis of what we wanted to discuss this morning. Minister Amorim also has expertise in nuclear issues. He's been the permanent representative of Brazil at the United Nations, but long before that in the Conference on Disarmament. Perhaps if you were there today, it might start working, or at least get an agenda. And then since his retirement, Foreign Policy magazine has ranked him the 6th among the 100 top global thinkers in 2010, which begs the question, like, well, who are the first 5? You
have to see the other 94.
Yeah, exactly. I want to start with particulars, because sometimes you can work from general principles down to particulars, but I think with a group, this audience tends to be pretty wonkish, pretty expert. And so I think often it's better to work from details up to principles. And so in that regard, let's start with the difficult challenge of Iran. And in May 2010, you and President Lula and your Turkish counterparts went to Tehran and negotiated with your Iranian counterparts to try to reach an agreement on the supply of fuel for the Tehran research reactor and for steps by Iran to build international confidence that its nuclear program was peaceful. This was an effort that had followed on a prior attempted negotiation in October 2009, where it was thought that there was an arrangement to ship Iran's fuel outside of the country, and then that ultimately did not come to pass. So you all in May did reach an agreement with Iran, between you, Brazil, Turkey, and Iran, and released a declaration to that effect. But as we all know, the terms of that deal didn't satisfy the Vienna group or the P5+1. And so then you reflected upon that, and I want to just read a quote and then ask you a question. But after that, you had written, the fact that Brazil and Turkey ventured into a subject that would be typically handled by the P5+1, and more importantly, were successful in doing so, disturbed the status quo. The insistence on sanctions against Iran, which effectively ignored the declaration of Tehran, and without even giving Iran time to respond to the comments of the Vienna group, confirmed the opinion of many analysts who claim that the traditional centers of power will not share gladly their privileged status. So my question is, after more than half a year, do you still have that sense of that was what was happening in terms of the reception of the Tehran Declaration? Or do you think that it was more about the terms of the declaration itself that prompted the rejection of it?
Well, thank you very much. It's a great pleasure being here. Thank you, Jessica. Thank you, George. Well, let me, since you want to be specific, I won't mention the other aspects of disarmament. We come to that later on. Well, first of all, let me say that we didn't enter into this venture because we decided to do that in abstract. We were not, but Brazil has, let us say, enough problems to deal with. We have 10 neighbors, which in itself is always a problem. You only have 2. I mean, we have 10. Fortunately, we haven't had a war for 140 years, so this is part of our credential in finding peaceful solutions. But so it's not that we're going around the world looking for problems to solve, but actually, if I just make, I mean, we can choose other marks, but let me just mention one. In the meeting of L'Aquila of the G8 plus 5 or G8 plus 8, because there were several meetings of this sort, but it was a G8 meeting to which Brazil was also invited. President Obama actually asked President Lula to help in the dialogue with Iran. He said, well, I reached out and I didn't have a response, and I can't remember because I didn't take notes personally, but it was something like saying, well, Brazil could help in this dialogue in a more general way, and saying even that it's good that we have friends that can talk to people that we can talk that we cannot talk to. So this is the general thing. After that, we learned about the swap agreement that you mentioned in relation to the Tehran research reactor, which it was actually a very smart move, I would say, by the West and by the United States in itself. I don't know if everyone is aware. I don't want to be speaking, but actually Iran had not asked to make this exchange. Iran had asked to the assistance of the Atomic Agency to buy fuel for the TRR, to the Tehran research reactor, which is, of course, part of the entitlement of the NPT and part of the duties of the Atomic Agency if a country is not a nuclear power to help. We have to say that this fuel, of course, would not be possible to use it as a weaponizing factor, because they are already, well, I don't know why, because I'm not an expert the way you say, but anyway, once they are transformed into fuel rods, they cannot be retransformed into something else. But they do use 20% enriched uranium. So they asked, they had bought something from Argentina 20 years ago, it's about to finish, and they asked the agency for help to buy, to purchase, not to exchange. Well, then, I think in a very smart move, but I say smart in a really positive sense, the response by the US and others, the Vienna Group, was that, okay, but instead of paying me with money, you pay me with light enriched uranium. Well, that was a very clever move, because that would take out from Iran a certain quantity of uranium, which would make it, if not impossible, much more difficult to arrive quickly at a nuclear bomb, supposing that they want that. I mean, that's another matter. So that happened, as you said, around September, October. We received even an envoys from the United States who knew that President Ahmadinejad was visiting Brazil in November. By the way, it's very interesting, because I say that because the Middle East is very much in vogue now, of course, for good and bad reasons as well. But very few countries in the world can claim to receive in the same month the president of Iran, the president of Israel, and the president of the Palestinian Authority. So this was really, all of them came in November. But prior to the visit of Ahmadinejad, we received envoys. Actually, I don't need to explain much, because in the WikiLeaks, according to the cables from the Brazilian embassy in Washington, it's very clear what they wanted us to do. I mean, we should be, the American embassy should impress on us the need to convince Iran to accept the swap agreement, which was this exchange, as I said, for the fuel for light enriched uranium. And actually, I received an envoy. I don't want to mention names now. It's not a question. I was, actually, he gave an argument which was very strong, in my opinion, in relation to past attempts in relation to Iran, and said, well, you have to tell the Iranians that this is very important. This was a US envoy, not an ambassador. Well, I don't know what his post was. It doesn't matter. But anyway, not the US ambassador or not. And he said, well, you have to tell the Iranians this is very important, because for the first time, we are recognizing, I don't remember if he used the word right, and maybe he didn't use the word right, but maybe we're recognizing the fact, or whatever, that Iran has enriched uranium. And this for them should be a big plus. And I agree with him, because all previous attempts I saw, well, as long as you don't accept the fact that Iran will have enrichment as other countries, you won't come to an agreement. That was my opinion. But this was a powerful argument, I found so, and if I remember well, probably that might be in some other WikiLeaks later on, I don't know, but if I remember well, he even told me, well, we may have even to adapt some of the Security Council resolutions, because somehow you were dealing with material that was enriched in contravention to the Security Council resolution. So this was the conceptual background. On October, the agreement was proposed, it didn't work. Ahmadinejad came to Brazil. The impression I had talking to him, together with President Lula, was that Ahmadinejad really had wished to come to an agreement, but of course, Iran, of course, I don't want to comment on how the society is organized, but it's certainly not a monolithic society. I mean, you can say it's dictatorial or autocratic or whatever you want, or whatever theocratic, that depends on the view of each one. But certainly it's not monolithic. And Ahmadinejad wanted to have a deal and was unable to have it. Of course, the reasons he gave, by the way, one of the first persons to be against the agreement was the leader of the more democratic opposition, Mousavi. He said that it would be a capitulation to accept that agreement. So when you deal with these countries, it's not everything black and white. The person who is more liberal internally may be more difficult to deal with internationally. So these are complexities that you find in foreign policy very often, and sometimes we tend to disregard them. So, but we try to impress on him the need to do that. Well, it's a long story. I mean, I visited Tehran several times. By the month of January, I discovered that the Turkish were doing the same thing. We hadn't arranged it before. Because we have good relations with Turkey, and once I was invited to talk to Turkish ambassadors, and in my talks with Davutoglu, I find out that the Turkish were doing more or less the same, trying to see how it was possible to operationalize the agreement. Well, the agreement had three main elements, if I might say, and one fourth element, which was a formal one. The three main substantive elements were very, I like to mention this because they are very concrete elements. They have nothing to do with intentions, or let us say motivations. One was quantity, the other was timing, and the other was place. And what was being demanded by Iran, from Iran at that time, October, was that it would release 1,200 kilos of light enriched uranium in exchange for the equivalent amount, which I think it's around 100 or 100 and something, amount of fuel with 20%. That should be done outside Iran, and that should be done immediately. And of course, because of course it takes time for the fuel to be produced. And Iran was saying three things. Well, the quantity is too big. We don't need that much. You know, it's like, I mean, the argument was, they didn't phrase that way, but I phrased that way when I had to explain to some people in Brazil. It's like, well, I have a car which will last 5 years, and you're asking me to buy spare parts for 10 years. So I don't need the equivalent to 1,200. That was the argument, for instance, of Larijani, who's the Speaker of the House. I need less. I need 700 or 800. So quantity was one point. The other point was timing, and they say, well, it's a question, it would be, I don't know, how do you call it, treason or whatever, to give our light enriched uranium before we receive the fuel, so it has to be simultaneous. So the second point for them was simultaneity. And the third point was, so this is timing, and the third point was the place. The Iranians were saying, well, okay, we can do the deal, but the light enriched uranium, our light, they say, LEU has to stay in Iran, maybe under IAEA supervision, but they even said, they mentioned an island, which is a kind of free trade zone or something like that. Yeah. So they were insisting on these 3 points. Mind you, my understanding of how it happened is that in a previous moment, the Iranian negotiator in Vienna accepted the deal, but probably because of the reaction in Iran, when they talked to us, they say also because the way the media played it in the West and the fact that it was said that It would delay the Iranian program for 1 year, and that, of course, made the Ayatollahs very angry. So for whatever reason, they backtracked. So, but this was the essence. So we tried to work on that. Well, the fourth element which I mentioned, which was a formal one, was that because that was always said to us, I mean, both by Americans, North Americans, and also by the British, and even others. They said, well, it's fine that Iran makes these nice promises to you, to the Turkish, sometimes to the Chinese, but they know whom they should address. There is a specific address in Vienna to whom they should write. And that's so there were 3 substantive and 1 formal. Well, these elements were reiterated. I don't want to go into these polemics now because I'm out of government, and I think President Obama just made a very nice visit to Brazil. But these points were reiterated in a letter by President Obama to President Lula 3 weeks before we went to Tehran. And so when we went there, I found our task was to obtain Iran's agreement to these 3 elements instead of what they were seeking. So immediate, not without the idea of simultaneity. So they agreed they would receive the fuel 1 year later. The place they agreed to put in Turkey. And the third point, of course, was the quantity. And even, I believe, 1 month or 2, maybe less than 1 month before that, the foreign minister, who fell later on, is no longer in government, Motaki, went to the agency and he said maximum that they could go would be 1,000 kilos. Well, we went there, we got the 1,200 kilos, we got the immediate release, and we got it to take place in Turkey. I mention this because these are very concrete elements: place, time, and quantity. I mean, I can't think of anything more concrete than that and more verifiable than that. So it's not a question of their intention. And in the declaration, it said that they would write to the Atomic Agency 1 week later. And they did, but unfortunately, for different reasons, the agreement was not considered good enough. I understand there were new questions, of course, because in the meantime, Iran started to enrich uranium at 20%, and also there was, let us say, the increase in inventory during this period. I mean, according to the main point of the agreement that was reiterated by President Obama in writing to President Lula 3 weeks before, so I'm not speaking of something 6 months before, 3 months before, these would, with these elements that I mentioned to you, would help create confidence. Really, that is what it was meant to be. I mean, I never thought that these would solve all the problems of the Iranian nuclear program and all the suspicions, but the first step would be to create confidence. We had 2 reactions which I think are interesting. I could mention many. I mean, there are people who, like, I mean, I don't want to mention names because I don't want to put words in their mouth, but from my point of view, they seemed receptive. Some said, well, it's 100% what we asked. Some said it's 80%, but even it's 80%, that would be a good thing. So that's basically what happened in relation to Iran. I just mentioned two of these reactions. One is Al-Baradei, who was the director of the Atomic Agency at the time that the proposal was made, and he gave an interview to the Brazilian press, which I asked him to confirm specifically because in which he said that the agreement the agreement corresponded to what was essentially asked, and it continued to be of great value. And he said if the agreement is not accepted, it's because the countries that proposed it cannot take yes for an answer. That was his reply. And I mean, even here, people who were involved in this question say, well, it doesn't go 100%, but it's 80%. I think among others, this John, whatever, I have his name here, who used to be in charge of Iran in the State Department.
Yeah, probably not John Bolton.
Limbert. No, not John Bolton. No, certainly not John Bolton.
Just kidding.
Yeah, John Limbert, who said it was 80%, what do we want? I mean, whatever, 80%, 85%. We thought it would be a confidence-building measure. We followed what was asked, and I must say that most people who were skeptical, what they would say, well, the Iranians are cheating you, we'll go there and they will not do it. They did it. So whether they would implement it or not, I don't know. But this was something that would be very, as I say, these are very concrete physical elements: quantity, timing, place. So you could very easily verify. I think in the meantime, the electoral calendar in the United States had changed. In the meantime, also probably You said you had, the United States had a dual track approach. In the meantime, you got the support of Russia and China through bargaining, actually. Allowing the Russians and the Chinese to do deals that others cannot do, according to the UN resolution. So these were changes that prevented us from doing it. We didn't do it on our, but I want just to underline that. We didn't invent that. We didn't invent the agreement, and we didn't have the initiative on our own. It was somehow incentivized by the US and others.
Let me gain some altitude on this and ask a broader question, because one of the principles in the Declaration was basically that, first of all, that Iran it owned the material and it could pull out anytime it wanted, but also that in essence there shouldn't be sanctions going forward, and that this was a position that that Brazil has taken in general about the general disutility of sanctions. And Director General El-Baradei, whom you quoted, had said all along that sanctions were counterproductive, weren't a way to solve the problem with Iran. So the question then is...
And got the Nobel Peace Prize.
Right. But the question is, in many ways, and based on your experience, do you feel that if a country is not complying with its IAEA obligations and others, that the only way to get them to comply, to negotiate, to deal with their obligations is through purely positive inducement? So in other words, if sanctions aren't useful, what's to keep a country from just saying, no, we're going to keep doing what we were doing 18 years before we got caught cheating. We're just going to keep doing it because what are you going to do to us? So how do you deal with that?
Well, since I'm no longer in government, I can tell you what I think about it, which I would not have said if I were in government. But I think that maybe sometimes the threat of sanctions may be something that may be of some use. But it's the kind of, sanctions is the kind of weapon that works better when it's not used. I mean, it may be there in the horizon. It may be a way of persuading a country to be more cooperative. And I must say that in my own talks with Ahmadinejad and Motaki, I have said, well, look, you want to have trade with Brazil. We are not in favor of sanctions, but if the United Nations approves sanctions, we'll follow them. And so many other countries that normally would have trade with you, or trade or other sorts of financial or economic. So we'll follow, as we have been following, by the way. I mean, President Lula signed maybe a little bit, not very happy. He was not happy, neither were I, but we signed the decree which instituted the sanctions once the Security Council approved them, because we follow the international law. But I think once, it's a kind of weapon that once you put it in use, it makes it useless in a way, because it tends to radicalize the positions. You tend to justify, I mean, take the emblematic case of Libya. Libya was 12 years under sanctions by the UN, I believe 10, 12 years under sanctions, and nothing happened against Gaddafi. On the contrary, he was more and more seen as a national hero that resisted outside pressure. Well, then sanctions were abolished. I'm not saying that to defend Gaddafi at all, but sanctions are abolished. The country became more open. The children of Gaddafi were received here by Secretary of State. Gaddafi himself put his tent in the Champs-Élysées. I mean, we know all that. And of course, you may have whatever moral judgment on that, and I think morals is important, but it's important to have moral, politically operationalized. That's the task of diplomats. The task of diplomats is not be moralizing all the time. It's to have effective results based on moral principles. And the fact is that after you had this opening, well, more people were open to new ideas, and you had a revolt that's still unfolding, and we don't know what will happen. So I would say it's not the question that sanctions can never be used, but I think in that particular case, it was a bit awkward if you say, well, I have 3 basic conditions. I want them, and this was reaffirmed to us in writing, as I said, reaffirmed to us. These 3 basic conditions will create confidence. You have the 3 conditions accepted, and then you say, well, but on top of that, we'll have sanctions. Well, in that case, I think you have more or less to choose your your way. And it's fine. I mean, if you choose sanctions, well, not fine maybe, but I mean, I can understand. But you can't really eat the cake and have it at the same time. We went in good faith because we thought if that agreement, which seemed impossible, even to us, because, no, seemed impossible, honestly, both in terms of quantity and timing and place, and I already explained, I don't want to belabor on that, which seemed very difficult, not impossible, very difficult. We obtained that, nobody believed. I mean, Medvedev would tell President Lula, well, this is Iran's last chance. Sarkozy would tell the same thing, oh, go there, but that will be last chance. So we got it. And then, of course, the sanctions came, and they came in a very brutal way, I must say, because it was something, it speaks a lot about the Security Council. It was a bargaining between the P5, purely. We learned the draft resolution through an agency, through Reuters, I believe, not from the P5 themselves, and it was the object of bargaining. Well, Russia got exemptions, China got exemptions, I don't know exactly. Russia read even, there was, I believe it was even an act of Congress by exempting Russian firms from some certain kind of unilateral sanctions, and for other reasons also, I don't want to say it was only that, they finally accepted. But, and then you see the contradiction. I mean, even symbolically, at one time, on the one hand, you prevent a country from buying gasoline. On the other hand, you allow it to have a nuclear, if you are concerned with nuclear, a nuclear power plant. I know a nuclear power plant doesn't produce weapons, but you know, even from symbolic point of view, it's difficult to understand. And to say that these are targeted sanctions, if you prevent a country from buying gasoline, that affects the poor people. It's not only the Revolutionary Guard that use gasoline. So anyway, that's my view. But as I said before, the fact that the sanctions are there in the horizon may have helped and may have influenced the attitude of Ahmadinejad. Mind you, the declaration itself doesn't mention the word sanctions. And actually, no, this is very important because the last discussion we had an 18-hour negotiation after months, but anyway, 18-hour negotiation to come to declaration. And, but at the last moment, they still wanted to introduce the word sanctions and say, well, there will be no sanctions if we follow that. And we said, oh, we can't put that in the declaration, because if you put that in the declaration, you'll be taking away the value of the declaration. And they finally agreed. They finally agreed. And you mind, again, this was an agreement that went to the highest level. I mean, we didn't discuss specifics with the Ayatollah Khamenei, but I'm sure he was aware by the, let us say, the body language, the way he received President Lula, and so on. So I think this was a missed opportunity. Let me tell you one thing, just to finalize this point, if I may. At that time, when we when the negotiation was proposed, I believe, nobody knows for sure, but it was calculated that Iran had something like 1,800 kilos. So they would give 1,200 and keep 600. When we finalized the agreement, they had something like 2.4. I don't know how much is needed to have a bomb, but I saw different figures. Even people from Israel, which is the most interested country, told me 2,000 kilos. I have also read smaller figures. But in any case, one bomb is not a nuclear arsenal. And one country cannot be compared to a suicide bomber. I mean, if it has one bomb, it's not an arsenal. But in any case, it was 2.4. Now, in the last report I had, it's 3.6. And of course, I read, well, we are still interested in working the swap agreement with renewed numbers, but it will be more and more difficult because, of course, the argument that I said of the spare parts for the used car will play the opposite way. So anyway, I think it was a missed opportunity. I mean, maybe it was not perfect, maybe I'm sure we would have to discuss the 20% enrichment, and I saw many people in Iran that would be, and I even heard from them directly or through the press that they would be prepared to discuss that. Maybe you would have to discuss the inventory, but you know, a confidence-building measure is a confidence-building measure. It's to put people around the table, and then you discuss what's left.
Did you I have to come back to this just because something you said. The confidence building that the IAEA and the others have been requesting and then demanding in resolutions for 8 years now includes transparency by Iran, answering outstanding questions, coming into compliance with its safeguards obligation and stuff. were you negotiating at that level of detail, or was the idea that you deal with this Tehran research reactor, which is kind of a sidebar in a way, and that was then going to help motivate the Iranians to deal with the legal issues where they're in non-compliance? And did they acknowledge that that's where this was leading, or did the focus really remain on the TRR?
Well, the focus was the TRR because that's what was asked from us, actually. As I mentioned to you, U.S. envoys even mentioned to us the importance of the TRR, because there was the belief that that would open the door to further discussion. If we want to discuss everything at once, then you don't get anywhere. I mean, you discuss the confidence building measure, and once the confidence is built, you go further. And I do believe that if you had that, then you probably would be able to go to other issues as well, which are certainly more complex because they are not so easy to verify as these, which are very, 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 let us say, as I said, they are physical elements. I can tell you something only based on impression, and this is an impression. I have the impression that there are many people in Iran that find that they have, well, first, Ahmadinejad himself is someone, well, since he's not an Ayatollah, he had said many absurd things, which we all know, and which President Lula even criticizing. I think President Lula was probably the only person in the world that could tell Ahmadinejad, well, don't go on saying these things on Holocaust because they are all rubbish. I mean, he didn't say rubbish, but that's what he implied. But anyway, Ahmadinejad was a populist leader, mayor of Tehran, who was interested in being successful economically, and probably he felt that the isolation of Iran was something that was creating difficulties for them. Then that may be an argument in favor of sanctions. I don't know, the ones that already existed. But of course, he could not look as if he would be weak vis-a-vis the Ayatollahs and so on. So I think he was interested in having this agreement. How far he would be able to go later, I don't know. But the other thing that I would mention is, that, again, it's an impression. It's an impression. Nobody told me that, and maybe tomorrow we'll read something opposite in the press if the Iranians hear what I'm saying. But I had the impression that they really need international community's assistance to develop their own civilian program. They don't have the capacity, and they somehow acknowledge that. And if you read in the first paragraphs of this declaration, one point in which they insisted very much is that should help on a cooperative attitude towards from the international community, or with the international community, between the international community and Iran. So I think, you know, of course these things you cannot never be absolutely sure, but it was the other experience I had with sanctions, by the way, had to do when I chaired 3 panels on Iraq long ago, and I saw the sanctions were having no result from the point of view of the weapons of mass destruction, but certainly were creating havoc in the civilian population in Iraq. So these are the 2 experiences I dealt. But let me just, because you asked the question, it's not that sanctions are useless and they may not be used, but it's you have to calibrate them in a proper way. And of course, if a door is open to negotiating, you cannot at the same time shut the door with sanctions. To my surprise, I must say, my surprise, so I have the humility to recognize that, to my surprise, even after the sanctions, the Iranians were still wishing to negotiate. Of course, they wished Brazil and Turkey to be present, which the United States didn't want at all. France said that they would accept. Russia said that they would accept through different messengers and means. But certainly the United States would not be happy with that at that time. In a kind of enlarged P5+1. So, there were several hints that they would, if they would come to an agreement, that they would stop with the 20% enrichment. So I think that was, as I said, in a way, a missed opportunity.
Let me ask one last question, and then we're going to open the floor. But this question has to do with the broader international order, and you know, which affects the nuclear domain, but everything else. And we know, for example, Brazil has wanted President Obama to endorse it for permanent seat in the UN Security Council, and so on. My question is, in international crises or situations, and the Iranian nuclear file with all of its violations of its safeguards agreements and so on is a slow-moving one. But then you have the circumstance in Libya, which was moving very fast last month. And one can have a sense that sanctions don't work, that force doesn't work, but you can also have gross or imminent violations of injustice, repression, violence on a mass scale, that requires some kind of action and doesn't allow for the protracted negotiations. What's your sense then of what a state is to do, what the international community is to do? I mean, I know Brazil abstained on the Libya vote a couple of weeks ago.
On the no-fly zone, but we voted
we
voted in favor of the sanctions.
Right, and so that's what I want you. So sanctions, sometimes yes, sometimes no, and but the broader sense of looking forward and fast-moving problems with states that don't either respond, quickly or without pressure. Where are we going with this?
Well, I mean, let me say, first, unfortunately, you may say, or fortunately, life is not very simple, and you cannot have a reply that will correspond to all situations. So you have to look at each situation and take your decision. It's not to take the recipe and just put there, because it's not like that. In the case of Libya, I think the fact that civilian population were being massacred or killed or whatever demanded some immediate action. Well, I'm no longer in government, so I can't say again very freely, but I think we acted correctly in supporting sanctions. I'm not absolutely sure about the sending of the case to the international court, because somehow, I mean, I'm not saying it is so, but supposing that Gaddafi is really, let's say, like a wild monster, I mean, it's better sometimes to leave a way out for the wild monster to go, rather than having an absolute moralistic approach, which makes it difficult for him to, makes it impossible for him to go out and so him or her, in the case him, and so he will react because there's no other way. I mean, but this is another question. But in any case, we voted in favor of sanctions. We abstained the no-fly zone, probably not so much because of the no-fly zone, but the debate is here. I mean, where are the limits? I mean, is this where all the necessary measures stop? We don't know very clearly. I myself was surprised when I saw the no-fly zone being implemented, and when I compared to the no-fly zone that existed in Iraq in relation to the Saddam Hussein actions in relation to the Kurds, this time it was a much broader interpretation of how you do. I mean, it was preemptive strikes, justifiably, maybe militarily, I don't want to go into that, but which were much broader than the ones that were used even in Iraq after Saddam Hussein, I mean between the two wars. So I was a bit surprised to that, and maybe it was this kind of preoccupation that the Brazilians and the Russians and the Chinese and the Indians and the Germans had. So it was not only a question of, let us say, one emerging country to others. Well, Germany is, I mean, a proved democracy, Western democracy, which you won't find any flaws, I suppose. So these were the kind of preoccupations that we had. And even now, as it moves on, and I see now today, for instance, the news is that the opposition is making headway. Well, what are the limits? It's an authentic question. I don't know. What are the limits between protecting civilians, which I think it's fine, in theory at least. I mean, it depends how you do it. I mean, this famous Hippocratic norm. I mean, first do no harm. But anyway, what are the limits between protecting civilians or taking sides in a civil war? What are the limits? I don't know. It's not easy to say. There are, of course, Gaddafi is dictator, authoritarian, whatever, but in any case, there must be civilians on the other side as well. I mean, how will you protect those civilians if the rebels go on and on and on and on? Which, I mean, I'm not taking sides. I'm not saying who is right and who is wrong. But it's a complex question, and I'm sure that even you yourself here are debating that because it's not very simple. But since you mentioned President Obama and the Security Council, let me say one thing, and this has to do with the disarmament and nuclear weapons. I don't know exactly how one would see that. And you know my positions in relation to the broader question. I mentioned that in 2 words, if I may. I don't believe that non-proliferation will be successful as long as disarmament doesn't take place. It's Article 6 of the NPT, and you know all that we have been doing to work on that. You know, you have an agency for the 2 other pillars of the NPT. You have an agency for the same agency, by the way, for non-proliferation and for peaceful uses. You don't have an agency for disarmament. So maybe it would be a good idea to have an agency, even theoretically, to start studying how you, I mean, there are studies by the Canberra Commission, the Global Zero, and so on, but they're not really an agency that studies in depth what are the steps that can take to disarmament. But let me say one thing about the Security Council. Well, President Obama went to India and supported India. Brazil is in all respects a country comparable to India. Of course, the only difference, the basic difference, unless President Obama was wishing to provoke China. I don't know if that was his intention. I don't believe that it was. But if it was not, Brazil is in all respects comparable to India. Of course, they have a bigger population, but we have 3 times India's territory. We're both democracies, we're both multi-ethnical, and we're both peaceful. The big difference is that India has a nuclear weapon and Brazil doesn't. Doesn't according to the Constitution. So what is the reading? What's the signal? One country may look for nuclear weapons for 2 different reasons, basically, and a mixture of them. One is security, which I think is wrong anyway, because I think it makes you more insecure having nuclear weapons. That has been our reasoning. The second reason is prestige. Well, if you reward those who have nuclear weapons and you penalize those that don't have, because I don't see any other difference between Brazil and India. India, by the way, I'm very much in favor of what President Obama said in India and in Delhi. Said it's good. But why the difference? Maybe the difference because we don't have a nuclear weapon? Well, conclusions are to be taken for the future. I'm no longer in government.
I have to thank you for that because it's a great way to begin the questioning with that provocation. I have an answer to your question, but I'm going to save it. I want to, please raise your hands, and there's some people at the mics, but also I want to, people, go ahead and raise your hands because we've got, mics can be delivered to you. And why don't we take a couple at a time? This gentleman here. You're going to have to do this faster, thanks. And then while Sinan's getting ready, then there's the lady in the back, in the middle in the back, please. Thanks. Go ahead, Sinan.
Sinan Ülgen from Carnegie Endowment. Ambassador, if you were in your good friend Davutoğlu's shoes, would you consider at any point in time taking the initiative again on Iran, trying to find a solution? Or do you think he has also drawn the type of conclusions that you have drawn in terms of the unease that the P5+1 has had with the involvement of Turkey and Brazil in this issue?
Hold your fire real quickly. Rebecca, go ahead, and then you take both.
Hi, Rebecca Johnson, Acronym Institute. Minister Amorim, this was very, very, very interesting to hear you speak such good sense on these very difficult issues. My question really feeds off your very last comments. You were a very significant player in the New Agenda Coalition leading into the 2000 NPT Review Conference. And I would like your view on what you think that the non-nuclear weapon countries, such as Brazil, the major players amongst, if you like, the medium power and larger non-nuclear weapon countries could do to devalue nuclear weapons, to take away that prestige and security myth that you spoke of, and move forward the nuclear abolition agenda.
Thank you. Too low now.
Yeah, well, I'm not sure I got the first. If I were in whose shoes? Huh?
Davutoğlu.
Davutoğlu's shoes. If I have, well, you have to ask that question Davutoğlu. He's still in office, so I'll not answer for him. But we were together in that effort. And what I can tell you, well, if I had the power of seeing the future and knew everything that was going to happen, maybe I'll do something slightly different, maybe. Maybe I would not rely so much on what I had heard or read in terms of what was necessary. But we did exactly that. I don't think we were naive. You know, I'm better known, actually, in the trade negotiations than in disarmament negotiations. And if you tell anyone in the trade negotiations, from Bob Zoellick to Peter Mandelson, that I'm naive, they will laugh at you. But in this particular case, of course, it was interesting to say that Brazil was naive. I think we're not naive, and I think the Iranians, up to the point that we had to work with them, acted in good faith. Very difficult negotiations, very, very, you know, it's not simple, but they delivered. Of course, I don't know if they would go on delivering and if they would implement what they have said. That's another matter. But I think we did the right thing, and probably, I mean, unless I would have the power of seeing the future, I would probably do the same thing. I think Turkey might have had its specific difficulties because it's a NATO member also, and but on the other hand, it's a country, it's a neighbor of Iran. If there is a country that is not interested at all that Iran might have nuclear weapons, is Turkey. That might bring us to the geopolitical situation in the region, and I can talk about that if you wish. But first I want to reply to Rebecca, who is my friend from a long time ago. Well, what can we do? I don't know. It's very difficult. First, I mean, I've been twice the president on the Conference of Disarmament. It's just a biographical coincidence, but I think it's a biographical coincidence that's bound not to repeat itself, because now with so many members, no one will live enough to be president twice. But I happen to be president twice of the Conference on Disarmament. In the first time, on the first occasion, we were able to prepare the ground for the CTBT. And on the second time, it was just after the 2000 NPT conference, and we were on the verge of being able to have a working program for the CD. And in the end, it was China who actually did. You know how the Chinese are. They didn't say they blocked, but they said, well, we don't oppose, but we don't agree. And the way the CD works, by consensus, it was not possible. And it was really a pity. And I don't know, maybe even the Chinese nowadays regret. And their main point had to do with the missile, with space, yes. So how you can work, and I don't know. I mean, you have maybe to think laterally and find ways. But I can tell you, if you don't make progress on disarmament, there will always be a danger of proliferation. There will be resentment, there will be questions of insecurity. I mean, if China has a bomb, why India doesn't have? And if India has a bomb, why Pakistan doesn't have? And if both Pakistan and Israel have a bomb, why Iran won't have? I mean, I'm not defending this reasoning, but you can see very easily that it can be made, and you can deplore that, but it's a fact. So it's only by disarmament. That does not mean that you have to have disarmament immediately, but you have to have a credible program with a timetable. And that's why I mentioned to you, I was discussing with our ambassador here yesterday. I say my ambassador, but that's in the past. No ambassador is my ambassador anymore. But anyway, I don't have even a secretary, not speak on ambassador. But so I discussed it and see. And he said this, he actually mentioned this idea of creating an agency. And I said, well, comparing with the Chemical Weapons Convention, I said, well, maybe it's strange because the Chemical Weapons Convention, first we agreed to ban it, to ban the weapons, and then we create the agency. But in a way, it could be good. It could be good to have an agency that would start working on, because it's not a simple thing. We all know that even if we agree on disarmament, it will take 20, 25 years. That's the estimates of the Global Zero and of others. And it would cost money, so how will it be done? So maybe sometimes you have to work out the technical part so that it doesn't become an excuse. So when the political will comes, then you have technical work produced. And maybe that would be something that could be done without going through the consensus building of the CD, which really, I mean, I've been there twice, and I see it's very difficult.
Right, thank you. Others? Including this gentleman here, if you can grab him, and then I'm looking for ladies. Norm, I'll take you if okay, I might have missed some, but this gentleman here, on the way, right here, on his first row on the balcony there.
But I want to listen to your reply to my question.
Okay, geography.
Mr. Ambassador, Michael Adler from the Wilson Center. I wanted to ask you, you explained very well how you felt you had struck a good deal with the Iranians, and I want to ask you, why do you think there was such a disconnect between what Washington thought about it and what you thought about it, given that the Americans felt the goal of the confidence-building measure was to leave Iran with not enough LEU to make a bomb, and that the 20% wasn't mentioned in the agreement, and also that the agreement very strongly reaffirmed their right to enrich uranium, which in the context seemed to fly in the face of UN Security Council resolutions.
Okay, I'm not sure I got the gist.
He was asking about the Tehran
It's my problem of hearing.
I apologize.
and saying that given that the quantity had changed and gone up, and that Iran didn't agree on the 20% enrichment, and also that the declaration strongly affirmed the right of Iran to do enrichment, which was contrary to Security Council resolutions. You know, weren't these some of the reasons for the U.S. objection?
Well, I don't know, but I think that would not, well, we reaffirm the right because in accordance with the NPT, there is the right. Of course, we know there were Security Council resolution, but as I mentioned to you, it was pointed out to me, actually by one of the U.S. envoys, that they would have even to revisit some Security Council resolutions if Iran agreed to the swap agreement, because the swap agreement was seen as something good in itself, because it would deprive Iran of a certain quantity. And according to the estimates I had, and the best possible estimate was El-Baradei's, I don't see anyone saying that it was still a substantial subtraction at that point. I mean, mind you, that was May last year. Now we are 1 year later, so it was still a substantial quantity, which would leave Iran in a very difficult situation to produce a nuclear weapon. Of course, people may say, well, but they have secret installations. Well, okay, but when the, I don't know about that, but when the agreement was proposed was because it was thought that the declared fuel, the declared uranium, was significant enough to justify an agreement. I think it becomes more difficult by the day to you, because I read today that according to the U.S. strategy, some sort of swap agreement would still be important, even with revised quantities. But I see the difficulty I see is that, I mean, if you take Larijani's argument, if you take Larijani for his word, I mean, if they only need, according to him, 800 kilos for the lifetime of the TRR, then it becomes more the disconnect between the quantities that are needed to ensure that they will not make the bomb and the quantities that they say they need for the TRR will become bigger. So, well, you can always imagine other ways of doing that, and I'm not in that business anymore. So unless I'm paid for that, there is no reason why I should contrive any new formula. But I think at that time, it was positive. At that time, it could be. It was reiterated by President Obama 3 weeks before. My God, he doesn't mention 20% enrichment in his letter to President Lula and to Prime Minister Erdogan. We know it is a problem, but it would be a problem that we would be able to deal later. And mind you, once again, the 20% enrichment only posed itself because the West didn't want to sell the fuel to Iran. They preferred to propose this smart deal, which I agree, it's smart and good and it would be positive. If it had just sold to Iran the fuel that they were looking for, this problem would not have existed. When I went, I mean, I just mentioned one thing. In one of my visits to Tehran, I asked President Ahmadinejad, but can't you postpone that for a little bit so that we can? And he agreed. Well, and you know, I spoke about 2 months, but I think if I had said 4 months, he would have agreed. I said 2 months and said, well, I'll do that. But then you know how the Iranians do it. They didn't present it as a concession. They presented it as an ultimatum. They said, well, if the agreement is not ready in 2 months, we'll start. So they actually postponed that, but postponed in a way that rhetorically was not very positive.
Well, and in fact,
what was the other question?
Well, I think this gentleman wants to ask, but let me add, before you do, Norm, real quick. You keep talking about Iran has, and others do, Iran has the right to do this, but the rights under the NPT are conditioned on being in compliance with your safeguards obligations, which they're not. So they had the right, and they would have the right if they were in compliance, but for these 8 years now, they've not been in compliance, which is part of the problem, is it not?
Well, maybe it was, but maybe then in that case, we should not have been encouraged, as we were all the time, to propose this deal to Iran, because then the deal itself would be in contravention to the agreement. The deal doesn't mention the right, but it recognizes the fact. So,
okay. Norm.
Just a quick question, Mr. Minister, if you could express what you think President attitudes of Brazil are toward the additional protocol.
what's the position of Brazil in relation to the additional protocol? Well, again, I'll just give my opinion. I honestly don't see how Brazil will take further steps in relation to non-proliferation before seeing some steps being taken on disarmament. It's really, I mean, there are different opinions in Brazil about that. There are people who think that we should sign the additional protocol. There are people who say that we should never sign it because we have done enough and so on. Maybe I have a more nuanced position myself, and I'm speaking only for myself. I'm no longer in government.
You don't have a secretary even.
So. Well, I don't have a secretary. So you see my email with all these mistakes in the English language, so you know that. Right? So I think it's very difficult that Brazil, any government in Brazil, be it right-wing, left-wing, center or whatever, would be agreeing to sign the additional protocol if we don't see serious steps being taken on disarmament. If there are serious steps, and what are the serious steps? Well, that's difficult to say. We have to start having a program. We start to have to multilateralize the obligations. Of course, the verification can continue to be bilateral between you and Russia, but you have to have a multilateral obligation. Well, if this starts and if this is serious, if it is credible, if the CTBT is ratified, several things like that happen, I think then maybe some sort of additional protocol which would not impinge on our technological advances for peaceful uses might be accepted, but it would imply these steps on disarmament.
Other questions? Anybody in the back? Anybody else? Then, while some people are thinking more, then let me ask you a question, because on the disarmament issue, and some of us who've been working on this for a number of years, we encounter that, and you see it in the Prague speech with President Obama, that in the White House there may be more interest in and more recognition of the potential gain from moving to a world without nuclear weapons. But when you travel, there are other nuclear-armed states that actually are much more resistant to the idea than the United States. And so I guess my question is, if non-nuclear weapon states actually comprehended that the greatest resistance is elsewhere, it may be in Russia, it may be in France, it may be in China, would that change the politics of this issue? For a long time, it was assuming that the U.S. was the main resistant actor, and it was the U.S. fault, and then you could say this. But if people really perceived that the greatest resistance was in Russia or France or Pakistan, would that change the politics of this?
Well, let me just try. Rebecca has mentioned our role of the new agenda, my personal role in this discussion in the year 2000. So I know very well where the resistance come. And I agree with you, the main resistance does not come from the United States for the very simple reason that the United States has such a superiority in conventional weapons that maybe for you, the nuclear weapons, I mean, of course, I'm making a caricature, but it's almost like the nuclear weapon has become the poor man's weapon because it's rude, it's brutal, it causes a lot of destruction and is not sophisticated. When I had to deal with that, in my view, it was not the United States, the main resistance. But I think you cannot underestimate the leadership of the United States. So if the United States agrees, of course, it will not agree to do that unilaterally. But if it agrees, allow me to make a comparison which nobody will like, but I'll make. It's like export subsidies. Export subsidies are the nuclear weapons in agricultural trade. Well, when the United States agreed to move forward, European Union reluctantly also went, and others, South Korea or whatever, also reluctant go. And I think the United States has it's such a power of leadership because it's the biggest power in the world, it's certainly the biggest military power, that probably the others would come. I see, of course, France was one of those who resisted more than Russia, actually, when we discussed in the year 2000. Later on, I was not so much involved, so I cannot, not so much personally involved in the negotiation.
Some things don't change.
But things don't change. But I can't see France blocking a general movement, you know, in which it would be alone defending the persistence of nuclear weapons. I can't see that happening. I can't see, honestly. It would not take the lead, but it will not resist if the US, and then of course Russia and China, and of course, I mean, if you go through these plans, I know very well the Canberra Commission because I've been part of that. I don't know so well the Global Zero, but I know I mean, of course there is a point in which let us say the countries that are like Britain and France should come also in destroying their own weapons. I mean, but this is, I mean, if you have a coherent plan, that would come, and I don't see they would be able to resist. It would be morally unsustainable.
Anybody else? One last chance for any questions.
But you didn't reply to my ladies.
Yes, the Ambassador Schaefer, yeah.
Teresita Schaefer, I have a big question for you, Mr. Minister. You've been talking about very specific instances of negotiations that touch on non-proliferation issues, but you've been watching the world in this business for a long time. What, in your judgment, is the biggest nuclear proliferation danger that the world faces today?
Well, you know, I'm not an expert, for instance. I'm not an expert in anything, but certainly not an expert in North Korea, and so I don't know exactly how the negotiations with North Korea are going. I'm not even an expert on Iran. But one thing that I would say, not only for nuclear proliferation, but the biggest danger in the world is the Middle East, of course. And one has to pay attention at the geopolitical changes that are taking place in the Middle East. And of course, the Libya case, which is not so much Libya is not so much Middle East, more Africa than Middle East, I would say. But if you look at the Middle East today, the really important thing will be Egypt. And the changes in Egypt will affect the region in more than one way. Certainly, it will affect the attitudes in relation to Israel, and it's not just a coincidence that the Fatah is now looking for agreement with Hamas, and that Mahmoud Abbas, who never thought of having this kind of contact, intends to go to Gaza. Well, why I'm saying that? Because I think the geopolitical in the region is changing. And mind you, both Egypt and Syria, well, they don't have nuclear programs of any importance, as far as I know, but they are not signatories, or they have not ratified, I'm not sure, the Chemical Weapons Convention. So it's not only a question of nuclear weapons, but it's also a question of weapons of mass destruction. So I think if I would somehow, apart from the general question of disarmament, non-proliferation, which I already alluded to, let us say the broader question for the whole of the world, I would really be focusing on a Middle East free of weapons of mass destruction, because this is really where the things will come. And this is really, again, probably, I mean, if you want to tackle the deeper questions of motivations in Iran and motivations in other countries, this is how we can get there. I mean, and probably if you have a conception of an extended Middle East that can involve other countries, I don't know. And so I think people have to pay attention to that, because Libya is taking the attention, which is natural, by the way, and Libya is very important because we have to discuss conceptual questions of no-fly zone, responsibility to protect, what is intervention, what's not intervention, and so on, and all this is very important. But in terms of the future of the Middle East, the country, and I was very happy yesterday to see the rerun of a program with Lisa Anderson, but the country that really matters is Egypt. And this has maybe, I mean, I think what's happening in Egypt is very positive, but if I look at it from the point of view of the United States, or even from the point of view of Israel, where I have been several times also, this may be negative, but it also may be positive. May be negative in the sense, as I just said, that it will not be so clearly pro-Fatah and against Hamas, for instance, and allow even Iranian vessels to go through the Suez Canal. On the other hand, you may have a more pluralistic and multipolar system in the Middle East itself, because Egypt being more democratic and more representative of its own people, then, I mean, Iran will not stand alone as the only country, maybe Turkey, but Turkey is, of course, NATO, so it's a little bit different. Iran will not stand alone as the only country that has, Egypt will have more influence. So, you know, the world is complex, and I think one thing that we should learn to do is not to divide the world in good and bad, black and white. I mean, it's more complex, and you have to deal with the complexity of the world if you want to have results. Of course, if you want only to make a moral statement, to have a diploma on your wall, that's a different thing. Then it's very easy. But, you know, politics is the domain of the relative. Religion is the domain of the absolute. And one thing that's not good is to mix the domain of the relative with the domain of the absolute. I'm in the domain of the relative.
That's a good way on closing. Separation of church and state could apply in
everywhere. I
was going to say
everywhere,
in any place.
Don't, in the media.
Don't get me started.
Yeah,
don't get me started.
Yeah.
I want to thank Ambassador Amorim for a wonderful discussion. I want to thank all of you, and we'll bring this to a close with a round of applause.